You're listening to Anti-War Radio on Radio Chaos 95.9 and 92.7 FM in Austin, Texas, streaming live worldwide on the internet, KAOS959.com. The war party's going on trial. Break out the popcorn and the chips and dip. It's time for the trial of Dick Cheney's former chief of staff, Scooter Libby. He's going on trial for felony perjury in the case of the leaking by the White House of the name of CIA covert operative Valerie Plame and what some see as a plot to get revenge against her husband for blowing the whistle about the administration's claims about Iraqi attempts to buy uranium from Niger. Yesterday, the defense laid out their strategy. It's all Karl Rove's fault. So, who is Scooter Libby and why should anyone care? To help explain, I'm joined on the phone by Justin Raimondo. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Hey, good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you back. And everyone, Justin Raimondo is the editorial director of antiwar.com. He's the author of Enemy of the State, The Life of Murray N. Rothbard, and also Reclaiming the American Right, The Lost Legacy of the Conservative Movement. He writes 3 times a week behind the headlines for antiwar.com. And now, Justin, who is this guy, Scooter Libby, and why should anyone care who he is?
Well, I mean, Scooter Libby was Dick Cheney's chief of staff up until very recently, until his indictment by Patrick J. Fitzgerald for perjury, obstruction of justice, etc.
Yeah, Time Magazine calls him Cheney's Cheney. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, it just means that he is sort of the perfect embodiment of Cheney's will in Washington. Cheney is the brains, and he is the arm, or the long arm of Dick Cheney.
I see. Now, I guess let's go ahead and rewind back to 2003. On the eve of war, during the State of the Union address, George Bush said that British intelligence learned that Saddam Hussein had attempted to buy large amounts of yellowcake uranium from a country in Africa.
Right.
He claimed.
And it turned out that the country in question was the African nation of Niger, which has as its chief export weapons-grade uranium. And
yellowcake uranium.
Right. And then they, turn it into weapons-grade, uranium through some process which I don't know anything about. But anyway, and so it just so happened that the evidence for this was so flimsy and so transparently wrong that it became a major issue. As soon as Bush said this, the International Atomic Energy Agency asked for the evidence. They said, well, if this is true, then tell us. Where it is, how it got there. I mean, how do you know this? And so after much hemming and hawing, the U.S. turned over the Niger Uranium documents, famous documents, which hardly anyone has ever seen, though they are posted on the web. And it took the IEAE scientists about an hour using Google, of course, to find out that these guys were faking it. I mean, these documents were forgeries, and they weren't even good forgeries. They were crude forgeries.
That's pretty bad when you can debunk them with Google search engine in 1 hour.
Right. And they just, they said these are forgeries. And, of course, the Bush administration was caught with its pants down.
Right, and now let's remember that the idea that Saddam Hussein had an active nuclear weapons program and was, in the words of Dick Cheney, reconstituting nuclear weapons was all important. It really came down to this Niger evidence and the supposed aluminum tubes. That's what really got Congress on board for this war in October of 2002.
And don't forget about the UAVs.
Oh, right.
Which were supposed to be flown from Iraq to the United States. And they were going to drop these nuclear bombs, which have been assembled with the help of the African nation of Niger.
Or either that or spray us with germs, right?
Right.
Yeah, everybody go get your plastic and duct tape.
Boy. And so, of course, shaking with fright, America went to war rather than face these fearsome UAVs, which, of course, never materialized. And
oh, now that's not quite true. CBS News posted pictures of them. They were made of balsa wood and string, and they were capable of flying, maybe a mile or two in any direction to take battlefield pictures.
Yeah, well, maybe we could use them to attack Iran.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, these scientists said, hey, wait a minute, these are forgeries. And, of course, the Bush administration totally freaked out and said, how could we have been fooled? I mean, I can imagine the internal discussion. And, of course, Bush, personally, must have been mortified, since he put this in his State of the Union address, which, of course, everybody was watching and listening to. And so, the White House had been burned. An investigation was launched. And, of course, you have to realize that, the Bush people were perfectly well aware of where this had come from, who had been pushing this. There had apparently been a big debate over this, whether to include these lines in the speech.
Right, because the CIA had actually taken similar lines out of the Cincinnati speech before, right?
Right, and it was just back and forth, and of course the neocons are very persistent. So, they kept reinserting it, and, eventually they won out. And so, of course, all this push, was coming from the office of the vice president, which is, the source of much of the so-called intelligence that lied us into war. And so, this investigation was launched, and as a result of it, eventually, Scooter Libby came to be indicted. They followed this whole story, and then...
Well, what happened was the guy that the CIA sent to Niger to investigate it talked to the French consortium that controls all the uranium mines there, and They told him, "Nah, man, how many hundreds of tons did we supposedly ship? Give me a break."
Yeah.
And he came back and told the CIA that, and I guess it's in question whether the CIA told the vice president's office about the results or not. But this guy talked to Walter Pincus at the Post and said, "Hey, man, don't quote me by name, but this is a lie." Mm-hmm. And then when the administration persisted, he went ahead and wrote this, former ambassador Joseph Wilson wrote What I Didn't Find in Africa for the New York Times, and that's what set Cheney and Libby on this path to destruction.
Right. Their own destruction.
Yeah, hopefully.
Not ours. And so, that's how the whole thing started.
Right, they decided they were going to get revenge against this guy, right?
Well, see, now the thing is that I think this is really the central mystery at the core of this whole thing. Because why did they go after, like Mr. and Mrs. Wilson with such a vengeance? It's not really explainable except if they were trying to cover something else up that was so important that nobody could know about at all. So their whole idea was to take these two people out completely, out of the running.
Maybe they had an ulterior motive. Besides Wilson, they really wanted to get at Plame, is what you're suggesting.
Well, right. And,
Well, and MSNBC and RawStory.com have both reported that Plame was working on Iran. That was her job, was finding out what Iran was or wasn't doing in terms of nuclear black market activity.
Right, and so, of course, with her and her whole operation, which, I forget the name of the company that they
Brewster,
used.
Jennings and Associates.
Right, Brewster
company.
Jennings. And so, of course, this company wasn't a company. It was actually, a covert CIA operation that was monitoring, like nuclear weapons programs in Iran, in Iraq, and probably elsewhere. And so, my theory is that they wanted to discourage anybody from going down that path of investigation, that they wanted to make sure that, like Wilson and especially Plame didn't look into where this forgery came from. I mean, who forged it, and what was their motive? Obviously, they wanted to get us involved in a war with Iraq, but who was doing this forgery?
Well, now they say that it was some Italian guy named Rocco Martino and his friends, right?
No. But, I mean, somebody put them up to it. Who was it? These guys are just cutouts, to use the old spook term. But who were they cutouts for? I mean, obviously, some intelligence agency was, doing this. But, the question is who? Of course, we don't know that, but, somebody was. And in any event, a crime had been committed. So, of course, the U.S. was investigating this. Somebody had contaminated our intelligence stream. And, they wanted to know who it was. But, of course, that investigation never really saw the light of day. All we have now is this Planegate thing, and Scooter Libby.
So hopefully you think we'll be able to find out answers to further questions like where the Niger documents came from in this Libby trial?
You have to remember what Fitz said. He said, look...
Now, wait, for the audience, Justin, who's Fitz?
Oh, Fitzgerald. Patrick J. Fitzgerald, the prosecutor in the case.
Mm-hmm.
And, basically, in explaining why he didn't charge Scooter Libby with outing claim directly and only charged him with perjury and obstruction of justice, he used a baseball analogy and said, well, look, if you throw sand in the umpire's eyes, then he can't make a decision about, is this a foul ball or not?
Mm-hmm.
And so, basically he was frustrated from going any further. And, of course, that was Scooter Libby's whole plan, to sort of stonewall, to lie, to make sure that no matter what, and even to stand trial for perjury in an obvious lie. And, of course, his whole ridiculous defense is he forgot.
Mm-hmm.
The dog ate my homework.
I love this one from the lawyer from the MSNBC article from yesterday. His lawyer told the jury in his opening statement, he spends his day trying to connect the dots to be sure we don't have another 9/11.
Yeah. Well, I like to connect his dots, and I'll tell you, that's what this whole thing is about. Is he was throwing sand in Fitzgerald's face so that Fitz couldn't connect the dots.
So what Fitz is saying is, once I'm through punishing you for throwing sand in my eyes, then I'll decide whether it was a foul ball or not and continue with the rest of this, perhaps.
Well, so maybe, some new information will come out in court. Who knows what witnesses he has. So, this is not over. This could be just the beginning, of the indictments, and prosecutions and trials to come.
Well, and I think people were pretty surprised about what happened yesterday, right? Your article says that just judging by the opening statements of this, the prosecutor's evidence that he's introduced so far and Libby's defense that he's been made the scapegoat, that this is already turning out to be the kind of thing where these guys are all pointing the fingers at each other and we're going to learn all kinds of fun stuff.
Right, and of course if I were Scooter Libby, at this point I would not count on a pardon. These guys are attacking the White House. This is the White House, which is, of course, the government, versus Scooter Libby, which is Cheney's office. So these guys are basically saying, you messed up, like the war in Iraq. No, you did. No, you did. So they're turning on each other. This is the Shiites and the Sunnis fighting it out in Washington. It's a civil war.
So
and it's not going to take as long, to draw that conclusion.
Well, let me ask you, and this is, I guess kind of delves off into speculation and so forth. But
oh, what fun.
I wonder if you think that perhaps this Fitzgerald investigation and maybe even the CIA's official complaint to the Justice Department that got it started had some sort of higher official or unofficial sanction from within the establishment, that it was time for, one arm of the government to do something about the cabal running out of Cheney's office.
Right. I don't think that's speculation. I mean, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that this investigation would never have gone forward if, you know, higher-ups hadn't given it the okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, the president, I mean, imagine you're George W. Bush. You just make this blatant statement in your State of the Union speech, and then, you know, like, the next day somebody pulls the rug out from under you. I mean, you're mad, right? So, there's an investigation. Suddenly, Patrick J. Fitzgerald is probing, you know, into the office of the vice president, pulling out drawers, subpoenaing people. I mean, this is war. These guys are after each other. And I would not be surprised if, you see, because of course, Scooter Libby has been indicted, but who's really being indicted here? It's Dick Cheney. I mean, Dick Cheney was directing this whole operation personally. Every day he was meeting with Scooter. They were plotting how to get this guy Wilson and his wife. And so when they indicted Scooter, I mean, they are pointing the finger at Cheney. I would not be surprised if Dick Cheney resigns before his term of office is up.
Now, he's scheduled to be a witness for the defense, right?
Right. So they're going to, I mean, obviously, they have all these journalists and all these other people who have one version of the truth. And then, of course, you know, you've got Scooter's version, and they're going to, you know, compare and contrast. And it's going to be very interesting to see or to listen to, you know, Fitzgerald cross-examining the Vice President of the United States.
Now, Libby is saying not only was he too busy saving our lives every day to pay attention to this thing, and that's why he committed perjury, but he's also saying, I believe his defense attorney's opening statement basically said that this is all about Karl Rove. Karl Rove's really the guilty guy, and that they threw poor Scooter Libby under a bus to protect Karl Rove because he's the guy in charge of getting George Bush elected.
Right. Well, you know, I'm sure that, you know, Fitzgerald looked into Karl Rove. I mean, you know, why else was he calling him back before the grand jury all those times? And, of course, you had all the lefties going, get Karl Rove, But, I mean, as I said consistently, you know, throughout that whole process, it isn't about Karl Rove. It's not about
Why isn't it about Karl Rove, Justin? If all the lefties think it is, what are they missing?
Well, I mean, what they're missing is that there was an organized group inside the government that was pushing an agenda for war, and that they were trying to force Bush's hand, basically, and say, look, you've got to invade Iraq. You've got to. And so, I mean, Karl Rove is, you know, Bush's man. So, I mean, he wasn't pressuring Bush to do anything. He just follows orders.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you have to look at the core of the cabal. It was not in the White House. It was in the office of the vice president.
And that's what you wrote back at the time was Rovegate. The real question is who leaked to the leakers? If Rove's out there telling everybody this, who told him?
Right.
And that would, again, you say traces back to the Cheney cabal rather than the CIA telling it directly to Karl Rove or something like that.
Right, because this whole thing was about the veracity of the evidence, so-called intelligence, that the office of the vice president was pushing in order to get us into war with Iraq. And so, you know, it was Cheney's office that was the spark plug for you know, all these, you know, subterranean activities.
Now, how do we know that?
How do we know that? Well, I mean, you know, there's the public record. There's, you know, the statements of, you know, the Cheney people. You know, we have people's testimony after the war turned out to be a disaster. You know, it was clear whose hand was behind it. I mean, these guys were pushing this line. And as we know, much to our chagrin, they won.
Yeah. Well, you know, there are some people still who say, oh, come on, nobody lied about it. This is what the intelligence agencies believe and whatever. And apparently to those making that argument, they've never heard of this, subgroup that you're talking about working out of the vice president's office and the Pentagon. Who exactly are these guys, these neocons, Justin?
Well, the neoconservatives came to Washington quite a while ago, and they've, of course, been around. They're ex-lefties, a lot of them, who, had a particular agenda vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. They were big hawks. Like a lot of them were, LBJ type, Democrats, like originally. Some of them worked for the office of Senator Scoop Jackson during the 1970s, and they eventually found themselves in the Republican Party, inside the Reagan administration, where they sort of colonized the National Endowment for Democracy and other, pro-democracy pushing, institutions in the government. And, today, of course, they're famous. Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, a whole brace of public intellectuals, Irving Kristol, his son, Bill, the editor of the Weekly Standard. I mean, there's a whole network. And, many of these people, are concerned with, the foreign policy of the Bush administration. In fact, they made the foreign policy of the Bush administration. And they've been pushing for war for over a decade, against Iraq. And they finally got their dream come true. And, of course, we're all living that nightmare now.
Yeah, now this is, again, what Lawrence Wilkerson, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who worked for Colin Powell, called the Cheney Cabal.
Yes.
And this was something that, I guess, for the rest of the professional government employees, they sort of saw this as this little group of political appointees who came in and, I guess as Seymour Hersh called it, set up this stovepipe where I guess they went through the CIA's trash, picked out the good parts, and sent it straight to the office of the vice president without going through the usual chain of intelligence, right?
Well, they didn't exactly go through the CIA's trash. I mean, what they did was when they weren't getting the intelligence, quote unquote, that they needed, when they went to the CIA and said, find us evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the CIA was coming back and saying, there ain't any there, basically. And so they were saying, bollocks, they're there, find them. And the CIA came back to them and said, nope, sorry, nothing there. So they set up their own parallel intelligence agencies, which, collected raw data and then cherry-picked it. And, of course, one of these was the Office of Special Plans, which was a subset of the Department of Policy in the Pentagon under Douglas Feith. And they would take this stuff and they would stovepipe it right up to the OVP, and of course the OVP, the Office of the Vice President, would take it and put it directly on the President's desk. And this, I imagine, is how the Niger Uranium forgeries got past the guards and wound up in the Oval Office. Mm-hmm. And in the 2003 State of the Union address. And we're still, the consequences of that are still playing out. Now, that was a big mistake on their part because, this could be traced back. And this, I think, accounts for the peculiar intensity of the pursuit of the Wilsons by the Cheney group. They wanted to make sure that nobody followed their trail back. But then they went and did something that's even more stupid. They outed a CIA agent in the process. So, of course, this is a crime. And Patrick J. Fitzgerald was tasked with finding out who committed that crime. And when he tried to find out, the Office of the Vice President obstructed his investigation by lying. Mm-hmm. And and possibly by hiding some documents. There's kind of an odd reference in the opening statement, like Fitzgerald's opening statement, where he says that Scooter Libby wiped out some memo or other. And so it's not clear what he's saying there. I mean, is he saying that, Scooter actually destroyed a document, or did he wipe it out of his memory? Mm-hmm. We'll soon find out.
Well, and there was some other new pieces of information that I guess we had never heard before in Fitzgerald's opening statement, such as that Cheney had actually written out an entire script for what Libby was supposed to say to the reporters that he talked to.
Yes.
So does that mean, Justin, that it's fair from now on to just refer to Cheney as unindicted co-conspirator, Vice President Cheney?
Yeah. I mean, that's what's really happening here, and I think that it's clear that one result of this trial could be filing charges against the Vice President of the United States, depending on who wins the showdown at the OK Corral between Cheney and Patrick Fitzgerald. That's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, well, I can't say it's often I root for a federal prosecutor, but I guess this is one time. And this would make it a lot easier to go ahead and impeach and remove the butcher George Bush from his office as well, if we don't have Dick Cheney as our default.
Yeah, but by the time all this plays out, his term is going to be over.
Yeah.
But one good thing about all of this is that it doesn't look like Scooter is going to be pardoned. I mean, if you're attacking the people who are going to pardon you,
right,
then, I don't think that bodes well for the, pardon.
Although, I guess if Bush was smart, he'd go ahead and pardon him right now. And, don't say anything else. But maybe it's too late for that.
Well, though, of course, you are assuming that there is not as much animosity toward the Cheney people in the Bush White House as there is in the anti-war movement. So,
you're right. I am assuming that.
Well, this assumption could be wrong.
That's
what's
fair.
So interesting about this.
That's fair, although I don't know. You tend to think, I guess, that George Bush was really angry that he got put up to saying this false information in the State of the Union. Then that he's really sore about being put up to that.
Well, it's not a question of him personally, though I'm sure he is. But I think that the people around him are sore about it. Mm-hmm. And they don't like being dumped on like this. We don't like having the rug pulled out from under them and being made fools of in front of the entire world.
Yeah.
And so, this is, and plus, this whole conflict is symbolic of the whole struggle between, the office of the Vice President and the White House as centers of power in Washington. There can only be one center of power. Mm-hmm. And so, in this official Washington, it looks like there were two centers of power that were constantly struggling for, hegemony. And now
wouldn't most people just say that Cheney obviously won and that Bush just does whatever Cheney tells him?
Well, Cheney won, but then, of course, Bush lost because of that. It's not, Bush's approval ratings are down, below 30%.
Oh, yeah, 28 now.
Yeah. So,
approaching Nixon at his worst.
Yeah, and of course, we all know the election results. So, people are holding the neocons and Cheney responsible for this.
Yeah, well, we'll see how it goes. The War Party on trial. Justin Raimondo, thanks very much for your time today.
Anytime.
All right, everybody, this has been Anti-War Radio for Radio Chaos 95.9 and antiwar.com for January the 24th, 2007. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with Dr. Gordon Prather.